Recording. Here we go. All right. What I want to talk about today is evolutionary altruism, which you can define succinctly as one organism uh, giving up a potential benefit um, in order to benefit a different organism. And those of you that hang out a lot in certain labs around here probably know slime molds very well. Believe at least two of y'all are working with Dr. Hazelcorn, who is certainly, definitely the top slime mold specialist at UCA. And these are a couple of these are what slime molds look like on their off hours. Group of single-celled protists in a group called the dictyostelids, and they'll spend much of their life cycles living as little single-celled amoebas, crawling around in decaying leaves and moist soils, and just hanging out, eating bacteria, uh, raising bacteria inside themselves as well. Some of you know that Dr. Hasselkorn works on bacterial and even fungal symbionts that live inside these dictyostelids. And they'll just hang out and do this sort of thing until the food starts getting scarce. And when they starve, they start making like the Beatles and coming together. That was a musical reference. Come together right now over me. Off the Beatles album Abbey Road. It's a really good song. And here these amoebas are coming together. They aggregate into clusters. They'll eventually form these millimeter scale structures called slugs that may crawl around for some time. And the slug will crawl around and eventually start growing into a stalked sporangium. Over at the left, there's a couple of things that look like, very low circular mounds. That's an early stage. You have later stage sporangia as you go to the right. The whole process takes about 12 hours. And at the far right, you can see that what we have is very thin little stalks with ball-shaped sporangia up at the tips. And the cells that are in the upper sphere form spores. And when the sporangium dries out and bursts open, the spores go drifting off on air currents. They disperse to new habitats, and if all goes well, if they drift onto a new place that's got plenty of food, the spores will open up and the amoebas will come crawling out and resume their free living existence. What's interesting is that this kind of lifestyle has evolved repeatedly. Dictyostelid slime molds do this. There is a completely unrelated group of slime molds called the acrasids that do it, that live in a similar fashion. At least I think they're still considered completely unrelated. There's at least one ciliated protist that does this, and there's even some bacteria called myxobacteria that do this. They'll aggregate into a lump, send up a sporangium, and then release spores to disperse. So it has not just evolved once, it's evolved at least 4 times that I know of. There may be more that I can't even think of at this hour. And here's where it gets weird. That's a diagram of a sporangium forming from a paper describing this back in 1944 by a biologist named John Tyler Bonner, who did a lot of thinking about the origins of multicellularity and things like that. The spores are amoebas that have little walls around them. The stalk and the attachment disc are made of amoebas, but those amoebas don't form spores. In fact, they form cellulose cell walls, and then they commit suicide. They die. Now, you can actually create and select for stalkless mutants. There are strains of the cellular slime mold Dictyostelium discoideum that have been selected not to produce stalks. And this is a puzzle because if you're an amoeba that ends up in the stalk, you die without leaving any descendants. If you're lucky enough to get up to the top of the stalk and end up in the sporangium, you have a decent chance of leaving descendants. But if you end up in the stalk, that's it. You're gone. You're dead. And this is a puzzle because how could natural selection explain giving up a benefit for the sake of others? Let's say you have genes that encourage you to go into the stalk and end up dying. Well, you've helped other individuals pass on your genes, but your own genes are going to die with you. So, under what circumstances could natural selection ever favor that sort of thing? How could selection favor individuals that don't pass their genes on at all? Now, I don't actually have a really good answer for the slime molds. That's been a model system for looking at altruism for decades, and I'm not sure we have a complete answer. Um, and if there is a good one, Dr. Hazelcorn probably knows it better than I do. So those of you in Dr. Hazelcorn's lab ought to go talk to her about it. I'm sure she'd love to hear from you. But it's an interesting way to start looking at the overall question of how do we get altruism evolving? How is it possible under your garden variety model of natural selection for altruistic behavior to be selected for? Again, we can define this as two organisms interacting in such a way that one organism gets a benefit and the other gives up a benefit. And often that benefit is a fitness gain. You can find some older explanations about how individuals could evolve to sacrifice themselves for the good of the species. But that doesn't seem possible under your standard model of natural selection. How can a gene become, or how can alleles become more common in a population if those alleles have the effect of decreasing the chance that an organism that has them will pass them on? Fellow by the name of Richard Dawkins, you might have heard of him. He's written some terrific popular level books on evolutionary biology. He's also noted as a rather outspoken atheist who wrote a book a few years ago called The God Delusion. You can, read that or not as you choose. But he made his bones with a book in 1976 called The Selfish Gene, presenting and explaining and synthesizing ideas that had been worked out by previous researchers in the field, probably the best known being William Hamilton and George Williams. Sorry, I'm just checking the chat to make sure I don't have questions or anything. Okay, what just happened here? Okay, there. So George Williams and William Hamilton and company, and Robert Trivers is another one, argued that group selection isn't possible. Dawkins argued that the best way to look at evolution is from the level of the gene. What a gene fundamentally is the fundamental unit of selection. What selection does is alter the frequencies of certain genes or certain alleles. Dawkins argued that if you look at evolution taking place from different points of view, what's favored from the point of view of genes is not necessarily what's favored from the point of view of the organisms that carry the genes. Genes that are favored by selection, genes that will become more common over time, are the ones whose effects on the phenotype maximize their own probability of replication. And Dawkins argued that, how do I want to put this? Dawkins argued that effects on phenotype that maximize a gene's probability of replication are not necessarily the same as the effects on phenotype that maximize an organism's probability of reproducing. So genes can have effects that increase the gene's probability of getting replicated and ending up in the next generation. But what looks beneficial from a gene's point of view is not necessarily what looks beneficial from an organism's point of view. Those effects on phenotype might increase the probability that a gene will be replicated, but not necessarily increase the probability that the organism that has them will reproduce. You have to take the metaphor selfish gene to be not literal, because genes can't really be selfish, right? A gene is just a little snippet of information. A gene is CGCGAATTACGACAGG, or whatever it might be. Genes aren't conscious. Genes can't try to do anything. Genes don't want to get passed on. Genes simply do what they do. Genes are basically very complicated molecules. And organisms don't consciously try to pass their genes on. Right? You know, the cardinals out in my backyard are not thinking to themselves, hey, I've got some really good alleles. I want to pass them on. How can I do this? Right? Cardinals aren't thinking that, and certainly slime mold amoebas aren't thinking that either. So this is another one of those metaphors that we shouldn't take too terribly literally, because we shouldn't attribute agency, you know, we shouldn't attribute goal-directed behavior to entities that don't have it. But in the metaphor, genes look as if they're acting to maximize their own replication, even at the expense of the organisms that carry them. That's what selfish genes means. So if we look at it from this point of view, how can altruistic behavior evolve? We start with the assumption, and it's certainly one that ought to be tested, but it does seem to work. We start with the assumption that genes can in fact cause or strongly influence organisms to behave altruistically. With humans, for example, it gets complicated because human behavior is so phenotypically plastic that we can learn to behave in a just ridiculous number of ways that don't necessarily make sense. But assume for what follows that, hey, sorry, the cat is trying to tap dance on my keys. Crazy cat. Assume for what follows that you can have genes that act in such a way as to create altruistic behaviors. How is this ever favored? One explanation is sometimes altruism exists because it's the only way that individuals have any chance of survival. There are times when altruism works because selfish behavior simply would not work in a particular case. And here's your case study. This is Buteo galapagensis, the Galapagos hawk, in the same genus as the red-tailed and red-shouldered hawks that you can see around here. Shoot, that I sometimes see flying over the house. Unlike red-tailed and red-shouldered hawks, Buteo galapagensis is polyandrous. You'll have stable groups of unrelated males that are all mating with a single female and sharing parental care of all of the chicks. Now, think back to uh, sorry, I'm suddenly drawing a blank on the name, but think back to what we talked about before break. When it comes to sexual selection, think that, one of our rules, which can be violated, of course, but one of the rules of thumb is that the sex that invests more in reproduction would be expected to be more choosy, and the sex that invests less, you would expect to be more to seek out a larger number of mates. This is kind of the reverse. We don't see polyandry all that often in the natural world because you would think that a hawk that could mate with one female and have her all to himself is going to leave more offspring than a male that has to share a female with other males, right? If you have a male hawk that is monogamously mated to a female hawk, all of their offspring should be his, unless there's some EPCs going on. If you have a group of males that are all mating with a female hawk, they're all going to be helping to raise the offspring, but only a fraction of the offspring are going to be genetically related to any given male. So each male hawk in a polyandrous group has fewer chances to pass on his genes than he would if he could pair up with a female exclusively. The reason this works is that the Galapagos environment is so harsh. Remember, these are volcanic islands. They're on the equator, but because of cold water currents coming up, they're not especially tropical, and they can suffer from extreme drought. They get hammered in El Nino years by serious drought. On some of them, there's not a great deal of vegetation because there's still lava flows every few years. So the environment is rough. And the way that Buteo galapagensis makes a living is one of those groups will stake out a territory, defend it against intruders, and hunt exclusively in that territory. Kind of, like Arkansas hunting clubs, I guess. And if you had Buteo galapagensis just pairing up into couples, a male and a female, and trying to stake out a hunting territory, they'd get sand kicked in their face, metaphorically. They'd get driven away because in that harsh environment, a group of males can defend a large territory much better than a lone pair could. So in this case, they have a lifestyle in which the males seemingly give up the benefit of exclusive reproduction. Each male has fewer chances to pass on his genes than a monogamous male would. But in this harsh environment, monogamous pairings actually don't work very well. So this is a case where we have altruism because it's pretty much the only way. Richard Dawkins has a great knack for coming up with great metaphors, and he came up with something called the green beard effect. What the heck is the green beard effect? He said, imagine we have a gene, or it could be a complex of linked genes, but let's say it's just one, that happens to have two effects. One is it confers a trait on individuals that have it. And the second is that individuals that have that trait behave altruistically towards other individuals that also have it. So imagine you have a gene, and if you have it, you grow a green beard. Okay, now you've got your mental image of a bunch of people running around with green beards. Can be men and women both running around with green beards. But the gene has a second effect. The gene is pleiotropic, meaning it has more than one effect on phenotype. It makes individuals that have green beards want to help out other individuals that have green beards. So if you have this gene, you have a green beard, but you can walk up to anybody else in the world with a green beard and say, "Hey, can you lend me $20?" And they're like, "Oh, yeah, sure, sure. Here, take 50, take 100." So the same gene causes a trait and causes altruism towards other individuals that have the same trait. Under those circumstances, it's possible for that gene to be favored. If you have a green beard, says Dawkins, that's actually favored because it means that everybody else in the world with a green beard will be altruistic towards you, and you can get benefit. Anytime you need $50, you can walk up to anybody with a green beard and they'll happily give you $50. Of course, you have to do the same with them, but under the right circumstances, green beard genes like that can be favored. And when Dawkins wrote The Selfish Gene, he considered this to be just a theoretical possibility. There aren't very many real world examples of this, but there was one that was found about 10 years ago and was found in yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, aka brewer's yeast. On the left, you've got some yeast growing in liquid nutrients where the cells are all suspended. They're just floating around, suspended in the growth medium, and the stuff just looks cloudy. The most common lab strains of brewer's yeast look like this. But the varieties of yeast that are used to actually make beer don't grow like this. What they've been selected for is, right, you add yeast to a malt solution, a sweet solution that comes from grain. The yeast start breaking down the sugar and cranking out the carbon dioxide and the alcohol, which is what you want because that's how you make beer. And as the yeast grow, they start clumping together and they form these clumps that drop out of suspension and build up on the bottom. And that's how you get beer that, well, these days they use filtering and things, but even before that technology, this was how you got beer that was clear. They used strains of yeast that naturally clumped together and fell out of suspension and ended up in these kind of cottage cheesy looking lumps down on the bottom of your brewing vessel, leaving the clear beer up above. And I guess brewers and yeast geneticists did not start talking to each other until recently, because the standard, laboratory yeasts were not flocculent, but standard brewing yeasts are flocculent. The cells clump together into these lumps known as flocks. So there's a flock down there on the bottom of that test tube on the right. And flocculation turns out to be governed by a single gene called FLO1, and that codes for a cell wall surface protein that binds to cell wall polysaccharides. You can see what that looks like down below. You've got scanning electron micrographs of non-flocculent FLO- yeast compared with flocculent ones, which stick together. That's a green beard because if you hit flocculent yeast with a chemical shock, they'll survive chemical shocks much better than the non-flocculent yeast because flocculent yeast protect each other. these bar graphs, if you take yeast and you zap them with an antifungal antibiotic called amphotericin B, it wipes out the non-flocculent yeast almost completely. Almost all of the flocculent yeast manage to survive. The same is true for 5 millimolar peroxide, which wipes out virtually all of your non-flocculent yeast, but almost all of your flocculent yeast survive, almost 80% on average. Even 10% ethanol. The reason why you can't make beer indefinitely strong is because ethanol builds up in a fermentation vessel and eventually it kills off your yeast. But non-flocculent yeast get killed at double the rate roughly of flocculent yeast, because the flocculent yeast form these clumps, these flocks, and these chemicals, amphotericin, peroxide, or ethanol, they might kill the ones on the outside, but the yeast on the inside can survive. And what makes this a green beer gene is that somehow the flocculent yeast recognize each other and they stick to each other almost exclusively. So if you grow flocculent and non-flocculent yeast together, the flocculent yeast somehow stick almost entirely to each other and exclude the non-flocculent yeast from those flocks. And so these are actually some slices through flocks. They've been stained. I can't remember what the dye is, but dead cells are staining blue. Live cells can exclude the dye, so they're staining. They're not staining, they're colorless. And so at the upper left, you have a control flock that's been cut in half. 2, 3, and 4, those have been treated with antifungal drugs or different alcohol concentrations. And you can see the cells on the outside of the flock are dying, but cells at the center of the flock are surviving. So if you have flocculent yeast and they form flocks and then you hit them with some chemicals, a few of the flocculent yeast will die, but the great majority of the flocculent yeast will survive because they're buried deep down inside that flock. And the same allele creates a phenotype, which is flocculation, and it creates altruism towards other genes with that phenotype. Flocculent yeast flock together and form these aggregates with each other. And if you zap them with harsh chemicals, most of the flocculent yeast will survive, whereas the non-flocculent yeast just get completely mowed down. So that's the best example we've been able to find of a green beard effect, where a gene is favored because it confers a phenotype and also creates altruistic behavior toward others that have that phenotype. So yeah, flocculating brewer's yeast is a green beard. Yet another way you can get altruism is through reciprocity. If you have organisms that help each other and the helpers have a reasonably good chance of getting helped later on, the benefits of altruism might outweigh the risks. And in species like that, altruistic behavior may be favored by selection. The conditions under which this can happen is you need species that associate with each other for long periods of time. You're not going to see this in solitary species where individuals might never interact except maybe briefly at mating or something like that, like spiders, for example. You might get this in herd animals or other animals with, a fairly complex permanent social structure. Organisms have to be smart enough that they can recognize and avoid potential cheaters. Individuals have to be able to reverse roles and be either the donor or a recipient, and the benefit to the recipient must outweigh the cost to the donor. Great example of this is humans. if you think about it, we live in most of the time in relatively stable social groupings, not just families, but circle of friends, groups of neighbors, people from your church youth group or whatever it happens to be. We form these long-term associations amongst ourselves. We can be either givers of benefits, like money, let's say, or recipients of benefits. And we're very, very good at keeping track of people that have cheated before and not extending altruism towards them. You could probably, I won't ask anybody to actually do this, but I'll bet you could name certain people that you would feel perfectly comfortable with lending $100 to if you had it, people that you'd absolutely give the shirt off your back because they will pay you back if it's humanly possible. And you may well have another list of people that you're not given a dollar to because you know that if you do it, you'll never see it again and they'll just try to screw you over. I've got my own little list of people I would do anything for and people I will not give the time of day to. And this seems to be a human universal. We're very good at keeping track of people we trust and people that we don't. And in societies that are too complicated for people to keep track of each other mentally, we develop things like credit ratings and stuff like that, to again keep track of who is likely to pay back a benefit and who isn't likely to pay back a benefit. Notice I said that the benefit to the recipient must outweigh the cost to the donor. Let's say it's a few days before you get paid, you're out of money in your account and you're really hungry, and you come up to me and ask to borrow some money, and I hand you 20 bucks. On one level, 20 bucks is the same, regardless of, who's got it. You can buy the same amount of food with $20 that I could buy with $20. We both get the same number of Happy Meals at McDonald's for our 20 bucks. But if I'm well off and you're starving, the benefit that you get from that $20 is greater than the cost to me. If I'm rich, I can give you $20 and not even think about it. If you're starving, that $20 is an immense benefit because it'll get you through the next few days. It'll keep you from, fainting with hunger. So in that case, the benefit to you would be much greater than the cost to me. It might not be a big deal for me to give you 20 bucks, but it might be everything from your point of view to get $20. Now, I'm not actually all that wealthy, so don't everybody start asking me for 20 bucks. But it's the but hopefully that illustrates the principle of the thing, the way that in human societies, the benefit to the recipient of a donation of money or food or something like that may be greater than the cost to the donor. So, moving away from humans, let's look at another famous case of this. This is vampire bats. Vampire bats are native to Central America, and they fly out at night looking for livestock or humans and cut into their skin with very sharp teeth that they've got and lap up the blood. They don't suck the way that vampires supposedly do. They have to make an incision and then lick the blood up. And then they'll fly back to their cave and sleep there during the day. Here's the thing, blood is very energy rich, and bats need huge amounts of energy. Flying is a very energetically expensive way to get around. Vampire bats can't go indefinitely without feeding. A vampire bat that fails to find a meal within 60 hours of its last meal is in imminent danger of starving to death. So vampire bats have been observed feeding each other by means of regurgitation. A hungry bat will sometimes ask a neighbor to barf up some blood, and the neighbor will throw up some of its blood meal and feed its neighbor. And it looks pretty much like what you think it is. They kind of put their wings around each other, and one of them throws up, and the other one licks it up. There, that's your disturbing mental image for the week. 70% of the time when this happens, it's taking place between mothers and offspring, and we just call this parental care. But the rest of it can happen between bats that may or may not be related, but it does usually occur between close neighbors in the colony. So, how does this fit our model of reciprocal altruism? First of all, when these bats live in stable colonies, and when they fly out and then fly back, they usually roost in the same spot. Every bat has its own little roosting place, which means that bats are usually flying with and then roosting next to the same neighbors night after night. Bats are also smart enough that they can recognize their neighbors. So bats know more or less who they are roosting next to. Okay, so that means that bats can form these stable long-term relationships. They're intelligent enough that they can keep track of potential cheaters. They could keep track of neighbors that always asked for blood meals but never gave them. Any given bat could be a donor or a recipient and may, in fact, be both several times throughout life. You know, on any given night, you might be unlucky and not feed, or on any given night, you might be super lucky and fill your stomach absolutely full with some blood from a nice unsuspecting cow or something like that. So either can be donor or recipient. You have stable long-term associations between bats. The bats are smart enough that they can detect cheaters, and the benefit to the recipient outweighs the cost to the donor. If you're a donor bat and you're giving up some of your blood meal, you are putting yourself at risk of starvation. You might end up going hungry, but it's not a death sentence. There's still a chance that the next night you'll be able to feed again. On the other hand, if you're a recipient, you're about to starve to death. So the cost to the donor is losing some stored food, but with a chance to make it up again. The cost or the benefit to the recipient is surviving. So the benefit to the recipient is greater than the cost to the donor. And it's been worked out that if you had a colony with no blood sharing, you'd expect that it would lose 82% of its adult members every year. The actual adult mortality is only 24% per year. If you are in an altruistic colony and you're an altruistic bat, if you're an altruistic bat in an altruistic colony, you've got a much greater chance of surviving than if you are a selfish bat in a selfish colony. Excuse me, cat. Excuse me. Sorry, the cat's trying to tap dance on my keys again. Nice kitty. Horrible cat. Right. So in that particular case, altruism is favored. One of the problems with altruism is, how do you detect cheaters? If you have organisms, if you have a population that's altruistic and an organism shows up that is not altruistic, that organism ought to basically clean everybody's clock. Let's say we have a population of bats where everybody is altruistic and every bat will give up some of its blood meal to help a neighboring bat. Let's say that a mutant bat shows up that does not have the genes for altruistic behavior, and that mutant bat accepts blood from everybody but never gives blood. If that's the end of the story, then you would expect the bat that always takes and never gives has a much greater chance of surviving and a much greater chance of reproducing. And you'd think the descendants of the selfish bat would become much more numerous than the descendants of the altruistic bats, who, let's face it, are risking losing their lives. The reason that doesn't happen is that these bats are smart enough that they can detect cheaters. They can recognize other individuals in their colony, and unrelated bats will often form these buddy systems where you have a pair of bats that will take turns feeding only each other. So the fact that bats are intelligent enough that they can recognize individuals and form closed buddy systems like this avoids problems with cheating bats. If there are any bats that have mutations of a sort that they don't behave altruistically, those mutations aren't favored by selection in this case. Okay, oof. One more way that you can get the evolution of altruism. Hamilton and Trivers developed a concept called inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness is the sum of direct and indirect fitness. Direct fitness is the type of fitness we talked about in the first third of the course. It's represented by all those letters W, right? It's the relative probability of reproduction among a set of individuals that have a particular genotype. So we've talked about that at great length. Hamilton and Trivers pointed out that you can have something called indirect fitness resulting from the successful reproduction of relatives. In other words, let's say you have an allele that causes you to behave altruistically towards your relatives. It might be altruism on you, it might take a benefit away from you, but it gives benefits to individuals that are related to you, which means they share your genes. You know, that's practically the definition of relative. So if you're carrying an allele that makes you behave altruistically towards relatives, it might decrease the chances that you'll reproduce, but it might boost the chances of others that are carrying the same gene as you. So that's indirect fitness, and the sum of the two is inclusive fitness. So imagine we have a gene that causes individuals that have it to give up a benefit for the sake of their relatives. Those relatives are probably carrying the same gene because they're relatives, and relatives by definition have genes in common. So even if our altruist fails to reproduce or doesn't reproduce as much as he otherwise would, the gene for altruism can increase in frequency in the population if it makes it possible for the altruist's kin to reproduce. Selection acting on that level we call kin selection. So William Hamilton proposed Hamilton's rule, and that is that altruistic behavior is going to be favored if the coefficient of relatedness multiplied by the benefit is greater than the cost. What the heck is that? The coefficient of relatedness is the probability that any given allele is shared by two relatives. It's also the average fraction of all alleles that two relatives share. In fact, I'm going to cut over to, hi everybody. I'm going to cut over to the whiteboard for a second. All right, there is our whiteboard. All right, I'm going to draw a little pedigree chart here. If you remember pedigree charts, we use circles to represent females, squares to represent males, and incidentally, diamonds in cases where the sex of an individual isn't known. So here is my dad. Wait a minute. I can't do that in pink. There. There's my dad. There's my mom. They have kids. And here's me. And there is my sister. That's not actually what she looks like, but I have to tease her even when she's not here to defend herself, and even though she's never going to see this. Okay, right. Think about this. With us, this is not absolutely true because the X chromosome is different, is bigger than the Y. But if we ignore that for the time being, I got half my genes from my dad and half my genes from my mom, right? Yes. So if we look at the fraction of genes that I have that I got from my dad, it's 0.5, right? Right? Because my dad took half of his chromosomes and packaged them up in a sperm cell probably around New Year's of 1969, rough guess, and passed them on to me. So one half of my genes I got from dad. Another way of saying the same thing is that for any gene that I have, there is a 50% chance that I got it from my father. And it actually works in the opposite direction. For any given gene that my dad has, there is a 50-50 chance that he passed it on to me. All right. And the same is true for my mother, because she packaged one of each of her chromosomes into an egg cell. And that egg cell eventually grew into yours truly. So our coefficient of relatedness is 0.5, right? Because for any allele that she has, there is a 50-50 chance that she passed it on to me. And in the other direction, for any allele that I have, there is a 50-50 chance that I got it from her. The same is true of my sister's coefficient of relatedness with our parents. For any given gene that my sister has, there's a 50-50 chance that it came from our mom. And there's a 50-50 chance that it came from our dad. Okay, what's the coefficient of relatedness between me and my sister? Well, let's say I've got a gene. There is a 50-50 chance, a 0.5 probability that I inherited that from my dad. There's also a 0.5 probability that my dad passed it to my sister. So for any gene that I have, there is a 0.5% probability that I got it from dad. And there's a 0.5 probability that my dad passed it to my sister, right? The probability of X and Y is the product of the separate probabilities, right? So for any gene that I've got, there's a 0.5 probability that I got it from my dad, and there's a 0.5 probability that my dad passed it to my sister. So there's 0.5 times 0.5 is the probability that my sister and I share a gene through our father. However, we also share genes through our mother. And so there is a 0.5 probability that any allele that I have, I got from my mother. And there's a 0.5 probability that any allele that my mother has, she passed on to my sister. And the probability of both of those is the product of the separate probabilities. So the probability that if I have a gene, my sister also has it, is 0.5 times 0.5 plus 0.5 times 0.5, which is equal to 0.25 plus 0.25 equals 0.5. So that means that my sister and I, on average, should be expected to share 1/2 of our genes. That's our coefficient of relatedness. For any given allele I have, there is a 0.5 probability that my sister shares it. And of course, we can keep going on this. As far as I am aware, my dad has not done this, but let's just imagine that my dad had kids with somebody that I don't know about. So let's say that I've got a completely unknown hypothetical half brother right here. Our coefficient of relatedness, of course, is going to be, well, for any allele that I've got, there's a 0.5 probability that my dad has it. And there is a 0.5 probability that my half sibling will have it, but we don't share any alleles through our mothers because our mothers would be completely different people. So the coefficient of relatedness between myself and my half brother, if I had one, would be 0.25. Okay, with me there. Watch this. My mother, I'll do this on the mother's side just because I'm starting to run out of space on the other. My mother has a brother. So there he is. And my mother's brother married Aunt Elizabeth, very unique individual. And they had 2 kids. My cousins, one of whom's a tour guide in Boston and one of whom is a Texas oil man. So how closely am I related to them? Well, I know that my relationship with my mother is 0.5. For any allele I've got, there is a 0.5 probability that she has it. And her relation with her brother is also 0.5, right? Because that's the relation between full siblings. Any allele that she's got, there is a 0.5 probability that my brother also has it. And then that her brother also has it, not my brother. And there's a 0.5 probability that any given allele that my uncle has will have been passed on to his son, my cousin over there. So they have a coefficient of relatedness of 0.5. So how closely am I related to my first cousin? Well, there's me and my first cousin. Think about this. For any allele that I've got, there's a 0.5 probability that my mother has it. For any allele that my mother has, there's a 0.5 probability that my uncle has it. And for any allele that my uncle has, the probability that he passed it to his son is 0.5. So the coefficient of relatedness between me and my cousin Holmes is 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5, which is 0.125. That's the probability that I have an allele and my mom has it, and she shares it with her brother, and he passed it to his son. And on average, that's about how many of our unique alleles we ought to share in common. That is roughly the fraction of alleles that my first cousin and I should share. And of course, you can keep going through second cousins and third cousins twice removed, and um, there's various other things that you can do with this. But yeah, 0.125 is the approximate number of alleles that I should share with a first cousin. Which explains JBS Haldane's joke. Haldane was a important geneticist in the early days of the modern synthesis, and he's the guy. He was an atheist, and he gave a lecture on evolution. And the story goes that at the end of it, some sweet little old lady asked him what all of his studies of the living world had taught him about God. And Haldane said he has an inordinate fondness for beetles. The joke being that there are hundreds of thousands of beetle species on Earth and only one species of human. So that if there is a creator, he evidently likes beetles an awful lot. But Haldane's other famous quip is someone allegedly asked him if he would give his life to save his drowning brother. And he said, no, but I would to save two brothers or possibly 8 cousins. Okay, you see the joke right there. It's because each one of Haldane's brothers shares, on average, half of their alleles with him. So if he dies and yet 2 of his brothers are saved, that's the same from the point of view of inclusive fitness as saving his own life. It's not a perfect statistical argument, but it is the point of the joke. And since each cousin shares on average 1/8 of your alleles, then if you give up your life, but you save 8 of your first cousins, then it's the same as saving your own life from the point of view of how many alleles get passed on to the next generation. So that's how you calculate the coefficient of relatedness. And altruism will be favored if the coefficient of relatedness times the benefit is greater than the donor cost. Nice case study, Belding's ground squirrel. This will be, I think, the last thing that we cover. It's native to mountain meadows of the western United States and Canada. And they live and they feed in groups. So they'll come out in a nice little mountain meadow and start feeding, but some individuals will stand on guard, especially if they're in Canada. Never mind, that's you may not get the allusion. But certain individuals will stand sentry duty, and when they spot a predator, the sentry will give an alarm call, and the group will run for shelter. The reason this is risky is that when the sentry gives an alarm call, the sentry is calling attention to itself. And the sentry is almost 3 times more likely to be chased by the predator. So from the point of view of individual survival, you'd think that, a ground squirrel that spots a predator ought to very, very quietly sneak away and let somebody else get eaten. Right? It's altruism because instead of, you're giving up a benefit, or maybe it's not so much giving up a benefit as increasing a risk, but you can think of the two as being kind of the same thing. You're running a risk by giving that alarm call. So how could this be adaptive? Why, you might think that ground squirrels that don't give alarm calls and quietly slip away at the first sign of danger would have more babies than ground squirrels that give the alarm call, and by doing that, draw the attention of the predator to their own position. You would think that ground squirrels that don't draw the attention of a predator are going to leave more babies than ground squirrels that do. So if every ground squirrel spent an equal amount of time as a sentry, this is what we'd expect. Adult females in a troop of ground squirrels make up roughly 40% of the individuals. So if sentry duty was assigned completely at random, the equivalent of drawing straws or something like that, then adult females should be on sentry duty 40% of the time. They should give 40% of the alarm calls. Adult males make up about 25% of the population, so they should give 25% of the alarm calls, and so on. 1-year females make up roughly 15% of the population, so they should give 15% of the alarm calls. That's what you would expect if sentry duty is simply, assigned by the equivalent of drawing from a hat, if it's assigned at random. But when we look at who's actually doing the yellow calling, who's actually doing the alarm calling, shown by the yellow bars, it turns out that females are much likelier to give the alarm calls than expected. Adult males make up 25% of the individuals in the colony, but they give fewer than 10% of the alarm calls. Adult females make up about 40% of the colony, but they give maybe 65% of the alarm calls. Almost all of the rest are given by 1-year females. Adult males very rarely are the ones that give the alarm calls. It's always the females that do it. Why? And no, it's not because the males are lazy and prefer putting their feet up in the recliner and watching football. It's because ground squirrels share a pattern that you see in a number of species where the grown males usually leave their colony. The males will disperse out to other colonies, so they can mate with ground squirrels that are not their close relatives. Females usually stay in the colony where they were born. The upshot of that is that females are related to many members of their colonies. Males generally aren't. A male is only going to be related to his own offspring in the colony. The females are much more likely to have not just their own offspring, but sisters and parents and cousins and aunts and uncle. They've got a lot more relatives there. And that's the proposed explanation for why we see that imbalance. A female that gives an alarm call has an increased risk of getting eaten, but she is saving the lives of lots of ground squirrels, most of which are going to be related to her. So if she has some kind of gene that influences her towards taking sentry duty, it may impose increased risk on her, but it's going to save the lives of relatives who are also carrying that gene because they are her relatives and relatives share genes. So since the female shares many of her genes with other members of her colony, if she has genes that influence whether she gives the call or not, those genes are going to be shared with other members of the colony. And a caller, a sentry that gives an alarm call, gives up a benefit in the sense that the sentry takes on an increased risk of getting eaten by a predator. But if the benefit to relatives outweighs the cost to the individual, that gene is still going to become more common in the population. That's inclusive fitness for you. And that shows that you can't evaluate the selective utility of an allele based only on what it does to individuals that have it. You have to look at its effect on relatives of individuals that have it too. We actually know that females are more likely to give alarm calls when close relatives are nearby. Ground squirrels are smart enough to be able to keep track of who's who. They can use scent and other cues to recognize who their close kin are, which is probably what these adorable little kissing ground squirrels are doing. There's a second case study that I've got for you on an East African bird called the white-fronted bee eater. A very cute bird there that's been studied since the late 1980s, but we are starting to run low on time. So by the power vested in me by the state of Arkansas, I'm going to stop the recording here.